Hi, I'm Lisa Hernandez.
And I'm Lizzie Getty-Ehrlich.
And we are your hosts for Scholar Strategy Network's No Jargon. Each month, we will discuss an American policy problem with one of the nation's top researchers without jargon. And this month, we are talking about a topic that we've actually never discussed before, cybersecurity.
Happy New Year. I can't wait to learn about it.
Yay, Happy New Year to you too.
Yeah, it's 2023. People were using their credit cards and their social security numbers and their all sorts of things probably over the past few months. And of course, we're gearing up to do our taxes. And all of these are things that happen online and deal with a lot of sensitive information.
Absolutely. I mean, we are here recording this through multiple forms of technologies all at once. So I'm excited for us to really talk about policies on a federal level that can really protect our security measures as far as our individual cybersecurity, but also just the government and different agencies' security as well. It's really important when we think about our safety, even though it isn't something that's always on our minds.
Well, yeah, we take a lot of this stuff for granted. Like there's this huge infrastructure and we all use it every day and we're storing our passwords and our money and our health information. And definitely when I think about cybersecurity, I think about what are my mom and avoiding scams and the personal things I can do, not about federal policy. So definitely interested to hear that perspective.
Yes. And we had a great conversation. So for this week's episode, I spoke to Jeremy Straub, an assistant professor of computer science and the director of the Institute for Cybersecurity Education and Research at North Dakota State University. Straub's research focuses on technology development and technology policy. He is the author of a recent SSN brief titled Cybersecurity Incidents Can Be Unwelcome Wake-Up Calls for Unprepared Agencies. Here's our conversation. Hi, Professor Straub. Thanks for being on No Jargon.
Glad to be here.
I am sure you're aware there's always something in the news about digital threats on a global scale, some kind of large company organization being threatened to be hacked. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, there were these fears of maybe Twitter becoming this big landmine for cybersecurity breaches. And you've been studying cybersecurity for some time with a focus on these digital threats that the government faces. So let's begin this conversation by talking about ways that cyber breaches can jeopardize our national security here in the United States. How serious have digital threats been in the past, and how serious can they continue to be?
Well, I think those are two really good questions. And, really, it's almost kind of the comparison between them that's kind of the interesting answer. We certainly have seen some large data breaches in the United States, everything from like the Marriott breach, where, tons of guest records were compromised, personal identity information was provided, breaches related to credit profiles, and even like the Office of Personnel Management or OPM breach, where lots of information related to security clearances was compromised. And, each of these has got kind of a different scope to it. In some cases, like the OPM breach, the data that was compromised was, particularly sensitive, but the number of people that were impacted was a little bit lower. When we were talking about like the credit profile information, obviously that's very sensitive information as well, not quite as much or as sensitive as what's in the background check files, but again, a lot more people. And then the Marriott breach, again, was a very large breach, but the information that was in that was probably not as sensitive as compared to the other two that I just mentioned. So there's been a lot, again, a lot of breaches, a lot of, people that have been impacted in some way, but we haven't really seen catastrophic breach in the United States. We've seen some things that kind of suggested what a catastrophic breach could be like. There was an instance of a breach that resulted in chemicals in a water treatment plant being incorrectly mixed, or at least showing that they could be incorrectly mixed. I don't remember exactly how far that one got right offhand here, but that type of thing could obviously harm lots and lots of people. I distinctly remember that it didn't, that nobody was specifically injured from that, and again, that kind of shows you what the bad cases could be that are much worse than perhaps what we've seen with, just a compromise of personal information in the past.
Do you see the United States government being worried about these scenarios or taking some preemptive measures in order to protect their agencies from these type of security breaches?
Well, there certainly is a lot going on. There are several agencies that have, kind of a shared responsibility, or responsibility, perhaps more correctly, for different areas of the national cybersecurity defense. And there's a lot of different efforts going on to try to get agencies to enhance their security posture, to be more aware of what they're doing, and to give them better resources and better standards to try to, try to get every agency from, the big agencies that you would obviously think would be very cognizant of cybersecurity issues on their own, down to smaller agencies that may not realize, the level of threat that's out there, or even the sensitivity of some of the data that they hold. So, at the government level, at the federal level, there is a lot going on. The challenge, though, is that it's not just government. It really is, everybody in the ecosystem, which includes private enterprise, it includes individuals, it even includes contractors that work for the government that might have access to government information. If any one of these areas has a problem, has a lack of appropriate security, it's possible that information can be stolen from one place and then used to attack another. So if you think about like a scenario where somebody might use certain personal information when they're coming up with a password, or as validation questions to recover their password, and that information can be stolen from another website, or somebody that's not governmental that they do business with, bank, etc. That could be a scenario where, even though the government system isn't breached, somebody can still get into that individual's account because they're able to to get the information perhaps necessary to reset their credentials from somewhere else. And then once they're into that system, they can use whatever permissions, whatever authorities the individual whose account that they have compromised has, perhaps compromising even more accounts. So it's really, a very difficult situation because, again, you're relying upon so many things kind of working right in tandem, which isn't always going to be the case.
Right. And you mentioned contractors who work for the government, and immediately I think about Edward Snowden. My producer Mandana and I were talking about when the news broke out about him in 2013, when he leaked what was highly classified information from the National Security Agency where he worked at the time. And I remember there was this debate about what government information needed to be private and what information the public had the right to know in the name of transparency. So I would love for you to talk about this. Are there some cyber breaches that are done in the name of doing some kind of service to the public?
Well, that's a very tricky question. I think there certainly can be, actors that feel that they are trying to do something in the public interest or in the public good. I think when we get to, to security questions, you have a variety of factors that you need to consider. And, it makes it a little bit difficult because any particular actor in the scenario, and, I guess, I'm kind of breaking the no jargon name here by not describing what I mean by the term actor. And so we use the term actor in cybersecurity basically to just talk about somebody that has a role in a breach. So we're not talking about like a Hollywood actor or something here. We're just talking about, in this case, like the person that might be thinking of leaking data or testing a system or whatnot. We call them an actor. But, anybody could be thinking, okay, maybe they're going to attack a system to show that it's insecure, or they're going to attack a system to try to access a record that they feel needs to be public. The challenge with that is that you're dealing with people that may not have the full understanding of the implications of the effect of what they're doing. So you can envision a scenario where even if, most people would agree that showing that the system is insecure is a good thing, or that, a particular piece of information maybe should be in the public domain, they may attack a system and actually create bigger vulnerabilities. They may let somebody that has, less, societally benefit motivated goals also kind of piggyback on their attack by opening a door that can't be readily closed. But it's also possible that while trying to access a system for these purposes, they inadvertently break the system or disable parts of its functionality. And, all of those are things that probably would, again, if we kind of assume that they have a public interest motivation, are probably not things that they intended to happen, but they're things that could happen kind of inadvertently. We have a strong societal recognition of the need for people to sometimes stand up against policies that they believe are unjust. But it becomes very difficult when there's so many concurrently moving or concurrently related pieces that you can't really figure out exactly what the implications of a particular action might be reliably before taking it.
I do want to talk a little bit about your brief that's on our SSN website, which will be linked in the podcast notes as well. But to focus on things that do result from these breaches, in your brief, you talk about something called the Snowden effect. Can you explain what that is for our listeners?
Sure. There's a few different aspects to it. And, that's one of those terms that I think, we've kind of seen used in a few different ways since it was originally coined. But I think you're thinking about a few things when you're thinking about kind of the impact of, Edward Snowden's data removal from NSA. And so, as an agency, you'd be thinking about, well, what happens if somebody else gets the information that's in agency records, and maybe thinking a little bit more about what types of data, you would be collecting, what types of data you'd be storing, even, how long you store it for. On the flip side, we can think about Snowden's impact from kind of a societal perspective as well, and impacts that it has had on our perception as everyday citizens of, what types of data government collects, what type of data government holds, which again, is caused some people to change kind of their perception of, of what's going on there. And some people, thought it was okay. Some people were very upset. And there's a very large continuum of reactions to that. So I think those are all kind of the different things that, you can kind of think as Snowden's kind of impact on not only agency action, but also on, kind of the public perception of agencies. All of those things kind of have a certain amount of interconnectedness too, where obviously the actions an agency might decide to take in the future, data they might decide to collect or store, is going to be driven by kind of a perception of how, members of the public react to being found out that the agency is storing or collecting that type of information. So you'd want to consider, particularly in the role of a leader of an agency or an individual in an agency who's making policy decisions like that, to try to make sure that what you're collecting, what you're storing is something that, you're going to be able to explain really easily to people. And I think it's also important to realize that, a Snowden style breach is not the only way that this can happen. From a federal agency perspective, Congress looking into something is another way that this type of question could be asked or could be brought to forefront. Even certain types of, reporting that the agency might do themselves might inadvertently identify certain types of information that's being held or stored. So it really, creates an impetus for agency leaders to just, take a look through, what are we collecting? What is the rationale for what we're collecting? How long are we storing it for? What are the conditions under which we're getting rid of the data or archiving it, or whatever other actions may be taken, to make sure that there really is, good decision making occurring. And, and particularly in the case of storage, it's really easy to just inadvertently store data, indefinitely, right? I mean, you have to usually take some sort of proactive action to remove it from storage. And so if you don't have a specific plan for that and assignments to do that, data can be there, unfortunately, waiting to be breached, waiting for something else bad to happen, indefinitely. And in a lot of cases, maybe it doesn't need to be around that long, and there doesn't need to be as much data there for a nefarious party to get access to if they do happen to breach something.
Do you have any advice for agency leaders, things that they should focus on to protect our data?
It really depends on, on the individual agency. I think the most kind of generic recommendation that I would have is really coming up with a good assessment plan. And, starting with the question of, what are we collecting, doing an inventory of what data is being collected, and then, doing kind of the same inventory of what type of data are we storing. Even agencies that are no longer collecting certain types of data might have that data, in their archives, right? So you really need to kind of start from the perspective of saying, hey, what are we doing now? What information do we have now? And, trying to limit collection to the data that is regularly needed for processing a certain type of transaction, making sure that the data that the agency, thinks that it needs for processing a certain type of transaction is actually used. Again, just because something is on a form doesn't necessarily mean that the agency needs it. And then, doing kind of a similar, but maybe a little bit different process in terms of retention, of trying to figure out, what type of data is needed beyond a transaction and how long it needs to be retained for. And, some of this, of course, will be statutory, which may mean that, an agency could actually figure out, well, we don't really need this, but we're required to collect it. We're required to store it, where they may require, legislative action to remove or change one of those requirements. A big thing though in regards to storage is perhaps the ability to reduce the amount of information that is stored after the transaction is complete, where some of the information you collect may be needed to process the transaction, but may not be needed for archival purposes.
Why haven't some of these proposals already been pursued more aggressively as far as addressing data collecting, data storage, especially considering how catastrophic a major data breach could be for the United States?
Well, there certainly have been efforts. And, even before, really thinking about this from like a cybersecurity perspective, the Office of the Management of Budget, OMB, actually has a role in looking at most of the forms that are generated by the federal government. I don't know if you've ever seen, any number of forms have like an OMB control number. You see a little block of text at the top. And there are laws out there that for most forms, for most agencies, there are some exceptions, require the form and the collection to be reviewed by OMB before it can be used, to make sure that it's not putting, a disproportionate or unnecessary burden on respondents. Of course, OMB is looking at this from their perspective, from their statutory requirement of looking at the burden that it places. But this is a potential model that could be used to validate forms and other types of data collections to ascertain if there may be unnecessarily sensitive information being collected by the form. Certainly, collecting information that is not needed is definitely an unnecessary burden, right? You're making somebody do something, in filling in a few additional questions or what have you, that is not required for the transaction. That's, but kind of the definition of unnecessary burden as it comes to a form. So some of this kind of already falls within, what OMB is doing, what OMB is supposed to be doing right now. But certainly, there are other things that could be added to it. And then there's also a very important role for the agencies themselves, who are the ones that understand their business processes the best. They understand what they're doing with the data. They understand how the data is used, and so forth. And there are some things that it's very difficult as somebody that's not involved in the daily operations of a particular process to realize, hey, we don't actually need that, or we used to use that, but we don't anymore. And so people that are involved in those processes are in a lot of cases the best place to get information about, well, we don't really need this, or we could figure out a way not to need this.
I'm wondering about maybe not just agencies' roles, but overall policy making. And is there more to do to make cybersecurity a bigger priority for the United States government?
Well, I think the federal government and certainly, many state and local governments realize how important cybersecurity is. A lot of governments have had breaches. They've had, perhaps in the case of municipalities in particular, they've had neighbor municipalities who've had data breaches, and they've seen kind of the fallout from that. Here in North Dakota, we've had a really big push at the state level to try to, think about cybersecurity as it relates to kind of all of the state agencies, thinking about how it relates to general workforce and their need to be aware of cybersecurity, whether they're working in a high-tech industry or a low-tech industry, and what that means, in terms of kind of the educational offerings that need to be made available in the K-12 system, in the higher ed system, and, vocational and other education systems. So I think there is a lot of focus on it. But, it's very difficult to deal with everything that needs to be done, of course. There's far more things that could have attention than ever get them. We see this a lot, too, kind of in the realm of, emergency response and emergency management, where, after, say a hurricane comes through, there's a lot of focus on hurricane preparedness, because everybody is so acutely aware of, what's just happened and trying to prevent that from happening again. And then as you get further and further and further from that event, that awareness naturally goes away. It's replaced by awareness of other problems. And so I think, you have public agencies that really have, an infinite number of, potential problems that they could potentially prepare for, and trying to figure out how to prioritize them. And I think one of the big challenges is having, policymakers, having those that are implementing policies understand how catastrophic cyber breaches can be when they're not targeted at things that can be corrected over time. Being a victim of identity theft is a very difficult process for those that have to go through recovering from it. But, it is something that, in the vast majority of cases is recoverable from. If somebody attacks a power plant and causes an explosion, or attacks a water treatment facility and poisons people, there may be people that get, very, very sick that have long-term health implications from that. And if the breach is significant enough, the explosion at the power plant, poisoning of a certain level, could even cause deaths within a very short period of time afterwards. That again, there's no way of reversing. So those are the types of breaches that I think we fortunately have not seen specific examples of in the United States, but there are very real vulnerabilities out there because we know that there are older systems that have a direct or indirect connection to the internet. We know that there are these critical processes that have these, human safety implications. And, even if you don't know that a specific process at a specific facility has a specific vulnerability, just by looking at kind of the worst case scenario, thinking, well, what if somebody managed to breach this facility? We won't worry right now about exactly how they do that. What could they do if they manage to get in the proverbial electronic front door? And, again, in the case of a lot of facilities, those answers are pretty catastrophic. Even disabling, the power grid or the flow of natural gas in certain areas of the country in winter, that could have a really catastrophic effect because it prevents people from getting the heating that they need. So again, there's just so many things, where we're dependent upon the successful performance of, various technologies that, a breach of them, again, could have really immediate, really dramatic human health, human safety, human life impacts. And that's the thing I think as a policymaker, you really want to be thinking about, not just, what happens if the data we hold is stolen, but what happens if somebody gets into our system and they actually do something nefarious and they cause injury or death? How do we prevent that? Whether it's, electronic safeguards, whether it's physical safeguards, whether it's disconnecting certain functions that we're not sure are secure or can be secure from having any sort of direct or indirect internet connection. Those are, again, I think really the critical things to think about personally.
Thank you so much for calling attention to that, on our podcast, using all our various technologies in order to get this information out there. And I do want to know if you have any more thoughts that you want to share on how cybersecurity can be further protected before we close up.
There's a few different things that are kind of, again, kind of the simple things that people can think about. For individuals, protecting your own identity information to the best you can is something that everybody can do. Being very cognizant of who you provide information to, what information you provide, making sure that you're just being a little bit skeptical, being, kind of the healthy skeptic of when somebody asks for information. Is this somebody that should be asking for the information? Is this person who they claim they are? How do I know that? And then, okay, they're saying they need this information. Do they really need this information? And one example is, if somebody calls up claiming to be from your bank, your insurance company, your utility provider, just saying, hey, I'll call them back. I'm going to get my bill out, or I'm going to get out the phone book, or look online on their website, look up a phone number, and then just have the person give you their extension where you can reach them back at. And, if they're answering the phone number that the company provides, as kind of a central phone number, and you're just being transferred off to an extension, you have a much better idea that they work for the company. And, it's a little bit annoying because you have to go a little bit out of your way to find the phone number and, end the call and restart the call. And, probably most of the time for most people, the call was legitimate, but now you know before you're providing, personal information. And, our personal information in a lot of cases is the gateway to these commercial systems. When somebody compromises an account, it's usually an individual's account, which means knowing information about the individual is a way to get into their business system. So, if you've made the password, this is not a good password, by the way, for the listening audience, but if you've made the password, say your dog's name, and somebody can figure out your dog's name or your dog's name and your daughter's birth date, and somebody can get those two pieces of information, and they can use that to guess the password to your business system. Of course, one thing you can do to prevent that is coming up with stronger passwords that don't have these personally associated meanings, but there's a lot of people out there doing that. So it kind of shows you how information stolen from one place can be leveraged in another place. And again, an attacker that is well motivated, what do? Well, they keep persisting, they keep pushing at their goal and trying to get different pathways to it, whether it's people's personal information, whether it's a more technical attack against a vulnerability in a particular system, or a combination of those. So everything we can do to make it a little bit more difficult for people to be able to do that makes things secure. And I think that's kind of the real key thing here, is to just again look at as many processes, again, kind of flipping to the other side, the agency side or the commercial system operator side, looking at as many different processes and saying, let's figure out how we can lock this down. Let's look at this. Let's make sure that we're managing information well, that we're managing access well. It really is just about looking at as many different things as you can and trying to make them as secure as you can, through this analysis process, and taking an unrelenting view of this, not getting to the point of saying, okay, we finished this analysis, we're done. And instead saying, we finished this analysis. Now it's time to go back to the beginning and see what's changed, see what we missed. Kind of always looking, to the extent resources are available, to the extent time is available, to the extent personnel is available, to just kind of continuously improve. And of course, the resources, the time, the personnel, that comes back to making sure decision makers understand what the implications are, so that they are providing those resources to the people in the technical roles that are able to use them to enhance security.
Well, thank you for sharing how we as individuals can protect our own cybersecurity, and, how decision makers can think about creating policy around it. And I will now go change my Coco 2003 exclamation point password in order to protect my security. That's a joke. That's not actually my password. But thank you so much, Professor Straub, for giving us all of this fascinating information. I definitely look forward to continuing to pay attention to cybersecurity, how I can protect myself, and also seeing what kind of measures the government is taking in order to protect it. So thanks for coming on No Jargon, and thanks for listening. For more on Professor Jeremy Straub's work, check out our show notes at scholars.org/nojargon. No Jargon is the podcast of the Scholar Strategy Network, a nationwide organization that connects journalists, policymakers, and civic leaders with America's top researchers to improve policy and strengthen democracy. The producer of our show is Mandana Mosen-Sargon. If you like the show, please subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your shows. You can give us feedback on Twitter at No Jargon Podcast, or at our email address, nojargon@scholars.org.